in the chat. Good evening and thank you for joining us. My name is Denise Olson. I'm with the Education Department at GBH. And thank you for your interest in this event tonight. We'll be focusing on teaching known and unknown civil rights stories using resources from the U.S. History Collection, which was published in the fall on PBS Learning Media. And we're very happy to share that since the collection's publication, it has had over 200,000 visitors. So we'll be pointing you to that collection tonight and encourage you to visit it if you haven't yet. We have a packed agenda tonight. We have some colleagues in the chat and they will be answering questions. We've also allowed some time for questions at the end. And many of you posted questions with your registration, and those questions have been shared with the presenters who have built responses to some of those questions into their presentations. Next slide, please. GBH Education is a division of WGBH, which is PBS's, which is Boston's PBS station, well, all of Eastern Massachusetts and parts of New England, and is the producer of many of the iconic series that you see on PBS, including American Experience, Frontline, Nova, Masterpiece, Antiques Roadshow, and many of the programs for kids that you see on PBS are created at GBH. In the Education Department, we produce and distribute at no cost educational content and services for equitable learning and development for everyone. Next slide, please. GBH is a partner in the creation and management of the PBS Learning Media learning platform, where you'll find the resources that you're going to see this evening. If you're not already familiar with it, please visit the site and explore. In particular, the U.S. History Collection. The site is free, it's easy to navigate, and we have thousands of resources across disciplines for pre-K through 12. You do not need to have an account to use PBS Learning Media, but it does afford you some extra features, which we'll get into a little bit later. The U.S. History Collection on Learning Media was funded with support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So we thank them very much for that and for their continued support. Next slide, please. So here is our slate of presenters for this evening. The Social Studies team at GBH Education is led by Sue Wilkins, who is the director. Sue is a former social studies teacher and director of education at the World War II Museum in Natick, Massachusetts. Sue, Alicia, and Lindsay all have extensive social studies classroom experience. And in fact, Alicia is still a working teacher in the DC public schools. Our colleague Ethan works on a variety of projects in the Education Department, and toward the end of the session, he'll be sharing some tips on using the PBS Learning Media platform. And then last but not least, we're thrilled to have Emily Silas with us. Emily is a longtime high school social studies teacher in Boston, currently at the English School, teaching U.S. history to English learners. Emily recently presented with us at the National Council for the Social Studies Conference. She was an EL advisor on the U.S. History Collection, and she is a current GBH Educator Ambassador. Next slide, please. Here is our agenda. We started our kickoff activity, and here's our welcome. Then we'll be introducing the collection and then talking about some of the civil rights resources from different eras. And then we'll do some live navigation of the site and give you some support tips. And then we have time for final remarks and Q&A. So next, Alicia is going to revisit our kickoff activity, and then we will begin the rest of the webinar with Sue. Thank you, and Alicia, you're up.
Thank you, Denise. While we waited for the webinar to begin, I asked you to indicate how many individuals you could identify. Now, each of these figures directly or indirectly contributed to the movement, and their names are listed on the screen. You got Harriet T. Moore, Harriet B. Moore, Berdia Kegler, Jimmy Lee Jackson, Atlanta Hamlet, Michael Schwerner, Emmett Till, Jonathan Merrick Daniels. Now, I don't have time to go over all of them, but number 1 and number 2 were very important to me. See, I'm a native of South Florida, and in all my years of living there and teaching there, I had never been taught or learned about Harriet T. Moore and Harriet B. Moore. You see, Harriet B. Moore and her husband, Harry, were educators and civil rights advocates. They both worked for more than 20 years as teachers in their local school district before being fired for their advocacy work by the district's white leadership. Harry went on to work for the NAACP, while Harriet found work in another district. They were murdered by the Klan on Christmas Day in 1951 as they celebrated their wedding anniversary when a bomb exploded under their house. Then you have Berdia Kegler. She was an activist who helped sue her sheriff for the right to vote in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, even after Emmett Till was murdered in the same area. In 1961, she filed an affidavit for a federal lawsuit to prevent the county sheriff from discriminating against Black voters. One night, her car collided with an oncoming vehicle on a highway, and she died in the crash. It wasn't until 2007, it was later found out that she had actually been forced off the road and was murdered by the Klan in retaliation for her activism. Now, these people lost their lives fighting for civil rights, but so many of us educators and history buffs had no idea who they were. Next slide. I would love for you all to take a moment to consider, why do you think you were familiar with some and not others? Feel free to quickly place your answers in the chat. As we're thinking, I don't know for myself, one of the reasons why growing up I wasn't familiar is because absolutely none of these were taught. We were simply just focused around mainstream figures. I have Susan, she says because white history is required and African American history is an elective, or at least that's the way it was when I was growing up. Yeah, completely understand. Aaron says popular media retells the stories of some people and not all. Sally makes an excellent point about, people are in control of information. Danielle, she basically says not all of them got adequate media coverage. And Michelle just like, hey, I didn't learn about any of these in school. Vicki makes a good point. She says their voices weren't allowed to be heard. And I love that Krista points out the gender issue in many areas that, sexism, we basically focused on just, male activists. And people are gatekeepers to information. Next slide. Now, look, I know that there's no way that we can know every person that contributed to the movement. It's impossible, and it's unfair to place that expectation on educators. However, we should work to broaden our scope and learn about more people than just what we've been taught and continue to teach our students. We have many resources in our collection that can help you. Today's warm-up actually comes from one of our resources entitled Unresolved. It contains over 160 stories of known and lesser known civil rights activists, and it's complete with the background reading, graphic organizers, and higher order thinking questions to help in the process. Next slide. And that kind of leads us to our central question for today's webinar. How can we teach a more inclusive history of the civil rights movement and make connections to modern day? Our goal for today's webinar is to explore strategies and resources from the U.S. History Collection to teach a more inclusive civil rights movement from a broader geographic and chronological scope, and with addition to both known and lesser known participants. And also, we'd love to show you how to navigate through the collection, set up classrooms, and assign resources. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I have to highlight, I love what Krista said. She said, learning about average people, quote unquote, makes activism more accessible. I think that is so powerful. And Krista, I think I'm actually going to steal that and I'm going to use that in my classroom because that quote sums it up. Thank you for sharing. I always like to begin all my webinars with the why, and that's how I also teach my classrooms. Why are we learning this? Of all the webinars that we could have given you tonight, we chose one about the civil rights movement. In 2014, a report from the Southern Poverty Law Center concluded that coverage of the movement was woefully inadequate and focused on a small group of charismatic leaders and a series of dates, names, and actions. A 2020 CBS study that reviewed state standards revealed 8 states don't even mention the civil rights movement. We hope that this webinar will broaden your understanding of the movement and provide you with the resources and strategies that you can immediately use in your classroom. Next slide, please.
Great, thanks, Alicia. Hi, everybody, I'm Sue Wilkins, and I'm going to speak for a few minutes now about this new U.S. history collection. It was mentioned earlier, this was officially launched this past August, and it contains about 400 digital media resources that cover the scope and sequence of a U.S. history survey course. The resources are designed for use by middle and high school teachers and students, and cover both core or traditional topics in U.S. history, but also elevate multiple perspectives, highlighting diverse narratives and stories. All of the resources on PBS Learning Media are free, and that's where you'll find the U.S. history collection. So I'm going to take about 10 minutes to share some of the collection's key features and resources. And all of the resources that you will see in the webinar tonight can be found in the collection. So some key points about the collection. The collection was designed to be supplemental, to be easily integrated into existing units and lesson plans. Resources cover, as I said, core and multiple perspectives and topics in U.S. history. There's a real emphasis on visual sources and visual source material. We think that's just a more engaging and accessible entry point for many students. The resources teach content, of course, but also every resource is aligned to 2 of 9 historical thinking skills. And we've built in activities to help students practice those skills, and I'll show you where you can find those in just a minute. We have support materials for teachers and students with every resource. And as we are all former or current teachers, we know teachers love to edit and adapt material for their students and their needs, and we've tried to make that very easy for you to do. And there's also quite a variety of resources and resource types in the U.S. history collection. So of course we have a lot of videos, but also many different types of interactives. And we only have time to share a few of the collection resources with you tonight, but we are providing you with a handout that lists all of the interactives currently in the collection by type. So interactive lesson, interactive image, timeline, etc. And I just want you to notice this emphasis on interaction. Students really are centered in the learning experience in these resources. And we've designed these resources, or we've tried to design these resources to be very engaging, very visual, and very content rich. So I'm going to just, I'm going to escape from this. I'm going to actually take us to the site now. And this is the U.S. History Collection homepage. And here you can see we have organized the resources into 16 different eras. And then also you can browse all the resources by the 9 historical thinking skills that I had mentioned earlier. So most of the resources in the collection include short form video, generally 3 to 6 minutes in length, that has been edited, adapted, or created with a clear educational purpose. This video is part of the Why It Matters series created for the collection. Each episode focuses on a topic that's been in the news recently and connects it to its historical roots to help students see how the past informs and connects to the present. So this particular episode draws connections between the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz and the 2016 Standing Rock Sioux protest against the proposed Dakota Access Pipeline. And it helps students understand why Indigenous people regard the Alcatraz occupation as their community's equivalent moment to Dr. King declaring, "I have a dream." Just move this out of the way. Okay, this is an example of a media gallery, and that is a collection of 2 or more videos related to the same topic, usually drawn from the same film. Videos are created from trusted brands like American Experience, Frontline, and Ken Burns. This media gallery relates to the civil rights movement, and it broadens students' understanding of how civil rights have been advanced. I think too often this is portrayed from like a top-down perspective. This idea that legislation, amendments, executive orders, they have all given equal rights to different communities. But this media gallery shows how the federal government actually acted in response to civic action from ordinary citizens. Now, I mentioned earlier that all resources in the U.S. collection are accompanied by a range of support materials. You'll always find them there on the right-hand side of the page. There's always sort of a bucket here for teachers and a bucket for students. So in the U.S. history collection, all resources have teaching tips for teachers, of course, and all resources have discussion questions for students. About a third of the resources have background readings for students, and half of the resources have student activities which focus on a historical thinking skill. This is an interactive lesson. You can always find what type of resource it is up here. This is a resource that is built on our lesson platform that uses a variety of images and videos and charts and maps and more to create a sequential lesson that helps students answer the essential question. And you can see the essential question here. Students can work at their own pace. I'm just going to continue as a guest tonight through the lesson. And on certain pages, there might be a place where they're asked some questions, and they can actually type their responses right here on the page and then save all of their work as they move through the lesson. At the end of the lesson, and I'm just going to move ahead here, we always return to the essential question, and students are asked to answer it in some form. It could be a full, writing assignment. It could just be write the thesis sentence that would answer an essay on this question. And in this interactive lesson, students are challenged to consider whether the label, the Roaring Twenties, is an accurate one. I love how on the first page, this sort of debate is set up by these 2 quotes. F. Scott Fitzgerald says it was great. It was an age of miracles and art and excess. And Cicely Tyson says, in white America, the 20s may have roared, but in my Black world, in what has been called the other America, the decade also moaned. And so the interactive lesson helps students understand both of those interpretations. This is an interactive timeline, and interactive timelines can focus on a few years. We have one just on the causes of the American Revolution. They can focus on a decade. We have one on the 1850s, the decade of sectional crises, or this one, which spans almost all of US history. Timelines are visually rich, chronological interactives, and each event on the timeline is displayed as a slide that can include text and media. You're seeing images here, but you could also come upon a page with a video like this one. Students can click through the event slides chronologically, as I'm doing, or they can go right to the bottom and select an individual event that appears. Here's an image of Rosa Parks' poll tax receipt, for example. And every timeline is accompanied by a student activity. That is one way you could, choose to have students work with this interactive. Like the timelines, interactive images allow students to explore and discover more about one or more image. The images selected always serve a purpose in US history, and they connect to core units and themes. In this case, this image is used to help students better understand how consumerism and buying on credit, which really took off during the 1920s, contributed to the Great Depression. So students click onto these sort of hotspots, and when they do that, they might come across, again, an image. This is a short video, and additional information. Students also have to use sort of primary source and image analysis techniques as they work with the image. And every image is accompanied by a student activity that you may choose to use with them. All right, and interactive maps allow students to explore different dimensions. In this case, foreign policy in 6 geographic locations. Students can interact with these layers or these buttons at the bottom, and then click on hotspots to learn more about a specific location. In this map, students explore aspects of President Nixon's Cold War foreign policy by literally clicking on the locations where his administration was engaged. And when students click on the icon, they're taken to another page where they might see additional text or an actual video. And here again, there is a student activity if you choose to use it in the student supports. And the last type of resource I'm going to speak to is just plain old interactives. And interactives like this one are built primarily for student exploration of a focused topic or time period. Like other interactives, students don't do work in the interactive itself. That only happens in the interactive lesson. Some like this one, this was created to accompany a big feature film. This came out with American Experience's The Vote a few years ago. But we've developed the support materials to give you ideas of how you might use it in your class and to identify the themes and the time periods where this best aligns. So that's a pretty quick introduction to the collection. I hope you will explore it further and see all that is in there. But I'm going to turn things now over to my colleague Lindsay, and she's going to turn our focus back to teaching a more inclusive civil rights unit. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue. And you can advance to the next slide when you get a chance. Tonight, while much of our presentation will focus on reframing the narrative of the Black civil rights movement, as Sue just exemplified and Emily will share later, the civil rights movement can be viewed in a very broad context with an emphasis on women, Indigenous people, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, and the LGBTQ community. We have several resources that cover these topics in our U.S. history collection, many of which you've seen and you'll receive tonight. So to start us off on reframing the civil rights movement, I want to take a moment to consider the standard narrative that many of us have been presented with, especially in our own education. This can be from the textbooks we grew up reading to the stories we heard portrayed in the American cultural fabric. In fact, many of the textbooks that perpetuated this narrative may still be in our classrooms. I know they were in mine when I was teaching. The standard narrative goes something like this. There were a few key figures who carried the civil rights movement on their shoulders, and they had opposing perspectives in the struggle against white supremacy. Martin Luther King Jr. is often portrayed as a nonviolent insider, while Malcolm X is characterized as the violent political outsider. Rosa Parks, meanwhile, gets a quick nod, remembered as someone who spontaneously decided one day to refuse to give up her seat on the bus. The civil rights movement traditionally has been presented as occurring in a finite space and time, neatly positioned between the years 1954 with the Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education and ending in the tumultuous year of 1968, the year that King was assassinated in Memphis. It is also neatly tucked away from the scope and sequence of American history, separated not only from foreign policy, but also from domestic policy. I'm sure some of you, like me, learned that there was slavery, and then the Civil War, and then the civil rights movement appeared in your textbook, seemingly out of nowhere, disconnected and disjointed from the American story, as you can see in the table of contents here. And finally, the civil rights movement historically was presented as a quote-unquote Southern problem. The images of the civil rights movement centered on the Little Rock Nine, lunch counter integration, marches, and boycotts do little to challenge this narrative. But when you widen the lens on the civil rights movement, it is no longer separate from the American story. It is the American story, a continual struggle and soul searching of the nation. It's the story of ordinary citizens whose collective actions, small and large, changed the course of history. And it shows the complexities that come into play between local government, domestic policy, and foreign policy. It demonstrates that actions happen through influence and that political decisions don't occur in a vacuum. And recognizing the immense challenges that teachers face today, our webinar tonight will provide ready-made supplemental resources from our U.S. History collection that can be incorporated into the framework of your existing U.S. History classroom to help you widen the scope and sequence of what the civil rights movement means in the 20th century. First, I'll be offering a reframing of the civil rights movement by looking at the decades preceding 1954. To begin, I want to widen the scope geographically by taking us out of the South, following the routes of the Great Migration. This resource on the Red Summer of 1919 demonstrates to students how racial violence permeated the nation decades before Brown v. Board.
Jim Crow was following the Great Migration northward, and both had landed in Chicago. In the last 2 years alone, an estimated 50,000 Black people had arrived in the city, almost doubling Chicago's African-American population. New arrivals crowded up uneasily against a huge influx of immigrants fleeing southern and eastern Europe. Those European migrants were divided by religion, language, and ethnicity. But they held one thing in common: an antipathy toward Black people. Business owners exploited racial tensions, frequently using Black workers to undercut wages and break strikes.
Marian Anderson travels to Chicago in 1919. That's basically a powder keg. And it has many of the conditions that you'll see in cities across the country. There's pressure on housing. There's competition over jobs. There are returning soldiers, Black and white. Black soldiers angry about their World War I experience and convinced that they've earned their full citizenship rights. And white soldiers determined to keep African Americans from acting on their convictions.
This tension erupted into what became known as the Red Summer, massive race riots that affected at least 26 cities across the United States, including Chicago, Washington, D.C., and New York City, exacerbated by the aftermath of the Russian Revolution of 1917, where many, with little or no evidence, suspected Black workers of being pawns of the Bolsheviks. Many Black veterans returning from World War I were mistreated and even attacked while in uniform. Lynchings increased. Membership in the revived KKK skyrocketed into the millions by the early 1920s. The Red Summer saw Black populations fight back aggressively against racial violence and intimidation, though, in ways that had not yet been seen before. The Red Summer of 1919 did not force African Americans into submission, as many had hoped. Instead, African Americans emerged from the violence of that bloody year with a greater sense of purpose, which lay a foundation for the civil rights movement to come. As I alluded to in my previous slide, global events had a major impact on the treatment of African Americans. As you watch this video from 1932, I invite you to please share your observations in the chat.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long ways from home.
The video that you just saw was an example of Russian propaganda from 1932. And our resource, Racism, Propaganda, and Global Opinion During the Cold War, will help demonstrate to your students how foreign policy dictated the response to civil rights at home. Soviet propaganda put huge pressure on the United States to revamp its image on the global stage. The Soviet Union challenged America's self-proclaimed leader of the free world status by highlighting anti-Black racism in the United States through various forms of media. At first, Soviet concern with US racial inequality was rooted in the belief that capitalism could only be defeated by the united efforts of the working class of all nations. But Soviet interest in American racism pivoted after World War II. As the US and the USSR competed for global influence, Soviet campaigns flaunted American racism, asserting the failure of American democracy. Embarrassed, US Presidents Truman and Eisenhower made refuting the Soviet narrative about American racism a national security issue. But Soviet pressure was not the only factor in shaping domestic policy around civil rights. Domestic policy was also shaped by relationships and stories cultivated with political leaders. I distinctly remember reading as a student that Truman desegregated the armed forces. And as you can see in this excerpt from Eric Foner's textbook, Give Me Liberty, I also taught it to my students too. But that one sentence kind of bothered me. Why did that matter? What would motivate Truman to desegregate the armed forces? Why would you desegregate the military first? But really, I think in the business of the school year when we're teaching, I never bothered to investigate that sentence further. But reading this textbook sentence without any kind of additional information or context really makes it appear that white politicians simply bestowed civil rights upon African Americans. But that's what this resource does. President Harry S. Truman, an unlikely champion of civil rights. It helps contextualize the motivations of presidents and other political leaders, making history all the more compelling for students. We learn that beginning in 1946, President Truman took meetings with civil rights advocates and initially rejected their calls for anti-lynching legislation. Walter White, the president of the NAACP, urged Truman to take up the issue of civil rights and knew that he had to appeal to the president's emotions by recounting the story of the blinding of Isaac Woodard. Woodard was a returning World War II veteran who was pulled from a bus for arguing with a bus driver. The local police chief savagely beat him, leaving him unconscious and permanently blind. Truman was so moved by the story, which tugged at his conscience, that he began to prioritize civil rights legislation. Truman took a major political risk to support desegregation of the armed forces, and he did so with Walter White at his side. But none of this would have happened without White, which would not have happened without the decades of groundwork laid by the NAACP. And now I'd like to turn it back to Alicia.
Thank you, Lindsay. I would like to provide us now with the opportunity to examine our own pre-existing limitations. In the chat, if you will, please list 2 or 3 images that kind of come to mind when you think of participants in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Thank you, Alexa. She says, well-dressed people, definitely. Nicole, all right, mentioned the GOAT, Fannie Lou Hamer. Leota, bus burning. Dogs, water hoses from Clive. Thank you. Brandon says Malcolm X. Crystal says something interesting, predominantly Black men. I got Jennifer, she says MLK walking over the bridge. Oh, I love it. Nina Simone's music, I love. Okay, I have Christina with the American Indian Movement, Diane Nash, all right, from Lisa. The Greensboro World Lunch Counter. And the list goes on and on. I see Fred Shuttlesworth, the Black Freedom Struggle. Absolutely. Next slide. But what I have to ask you, I would love for you to consider if the faces of the young girls on the right are the faces of protesters that we show our students during the civil rights movement. Are we giving everyone a voice, or are we being selective in our narratives? Are we only showing our students pictures of protesters outside of their age group, mostly the pictures of people on the left? Next slide. The young ladies on the right-hand side of the previous slide were a group of young girls known as the Leesburg Stockade Girls. They range in ages from 12 to 15. If you don't know their story, they were jailed for protesting segregation at a local theater. They were arrested and then held in squalor in a Leesburg, Georgia center in 1963. Their parents had no idea where they were for weeks. Their story should also be told because our students can probably relate to them more so than the college age students that we usually tell them about in SNCC or CORE, or the 30-something-year-olds that we talk about in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. If you'd like to introduce their story to our students, we do have this resource available in our collection, and you can introduce them by giving your students an anticipation guide, as you see on the screen, as a warm-up, which is pictured. Students are presented with a series of statements about the civil rights movement and its participants, and they're asked to evaluate the statement. So questions such as, most organized protesters were led by appointed officials from major civil rights organizations. Protests in dangerous areas of the South were led primarily by men. Protesters tended to be overwhelmingly from the middle class, and the list goes on. Next slide, please. This is a great way to gain their attention, help students focus, and provide them with attentionality. You then can show them the video in our collection that introduces the students to some of the actual surviving members who take them for a tour of the stockade and describe their experience. Next slide. After having our students watch the video, or even during, you can pass out part 2 of the anticipation guide, where they evaluate their original statements, determine whether they now think the statements are true or false, and then provide evidence from the video to actually support their position. Next slide. I wanted us to also consider the narrative we're providing our students of the strategies used during the civil rights movement. As Lindsay said, traditional curriculums frame the movement as an either or one versus the other. Teachers love having our students compare and play Malcolm against Martin, nonviolence against self-defense. Next slide. But in actuality, self-defense has always been a strategy during and after slavery. And it was often used in cities that will never be mentioned in our textbooks, often used in towns where major leaders in the movement never visited. But we tend to omit the historical examples where self-defense was used as a strategy, or present it in a way that makes it seem that it was one that was used by radicals, when in actuality, it was used by many ordinary citizens that felt it was their constitutional right to defend themselves and who could no longer accept living in towns where the people that were sworn to protect them, like the police, were members of the Klan. And such was the case in Natchez, Mississippi, with the Deacons of Defense. If you're not familiar, the Deacons for Defense and Justice was founded in 1964 in Jonesboro, Louisiana, to protect civil rights activists from the Klan. The organization was made up of Black veterans from World War II who believed in armed self-defense. About 20 chapters were created throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. The Deacons for Defense provided protection for people participating in protest marches in Mississippi in 1966, including the March Against Fear. We have an excellent resource on the chapter that emerged in Natchez, Mississippi. Here you have the local activists who organized a boycott of the local white businesses and used the combination of nonviolent and self-defense strategies, and they were successful. Their story also needs to be told, and I completely agree with Shirley. Absolutely, self-defense is not radical. Next slide. So you can actually begin with opening up with the conversation with your class around the question, when is self-defense justified? You see, I don't pose the question if it is justified, because I strongly believe it's easy to say what is right or what is wrong, or what you would or would not have done if you're not living in an era like the civil rights time period. You can then have your students create a list of reasons when self-defense is justified, and have your students as a class vote on the list as a class. Next slide. Now we have 4 accompanying videos in this particular resource. The next thing you could do is show students the first resource in the series entitled No Avenues for Justice or Protection, and it is intense. It opens with an activist family who is being tailed by the Klan on a dark southern country road in fear of their lives. I like it because for those students who love to argue that nonviolence and turn the other cheek should always be the only option, this clip provides them with the reality of what a statement like that actually means in the 1960s. The members of the community then explain point by point why they have decided to adopt a policy of self-defense. You get a chance to actually hear their voices and hear their perspectives. I like to have students then compare their lists with the reasons the people of Natchez gave for arming themselves and fighting back, and then discuss the results. And at the end, it's all about self-reflection, right? Have the students ask themselves to what extent their initial feelings about when self-defense is justified changed after seeing the video. Next slide, please. You then can follow up. You can have the students watch the next videos, Deacons for Self-Defense and Justice, The Boycott Begins and Boycott Ends. And then what I love to have students do is create a Venn diagram. Have them compare the actual application of self-defense and nonviolence in the 1960s. Have them compare on one circle the Natchez boycott, which was highlighted in the film, where they used the combined strategy of nonviolence and self-defense, to the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, which all of our students are familiar with, which was strictly nonviolence. And this will help them really to see what the strategy looked like. Our students, they have this image that self-defense for Black people was one where they are the aggressors, when in actuality, it was simply doing what the police and the FBI refused to do, offer them protection. Next slide. I lastly wanted to also encourage you to think about the narrative we're presenting to our students on the diversity or lack thereof in civil rights leaders. Many statewide curriculums construct the narrative of the movement around its leaders, but not all the leaders in the movement were college students or graduates or came from middle-class families like Julian Bond right here or Dr. King. There was diversity and leadership. Next slide. Take the GOAT. All right, Fannie Lou Hamer. All right, she was an acclaimed civil rights activist. She was referenced in our warm-up. Her parents were sharecroppers. She was the youngest of 20 children and she grew up in poverty. She dropped out of school at age 12 to pick cotton full time. Next slide. Our students would really benefit from watching a resource that we have on her and being able to explore the hardships she and her family endured as sharecroppers in Mississippi and how her background shaped and offered her an invaluable perspective on racial and economic justice. And yes, I have to agree with Shirley one more time. I really love this exercise because we cannot forget the women that were also part of the movement. You could have students watch our video and then complete this supporting worksheet that we offer, which asks students questions such as describe Hamer's life at 13 years of age as they're watching the film. To what extent was she unable to enjoy the freedoms and opportunities that an average 13-year-old child should experience? So once again, it's having them really put themselves in the position of Fannie Lou Hamer and compare her life to their lives today. You can also have them ask themselves, what were some items or goods that she was always in need of that's highlighted in the film? What caused these persistent needs? And how were her experiences as a child shaped by her family's occupation as sharecroppers? And what I love about this activity is it also asks our students to consider many of the participants in the movement were college students. How and why do you think Hamer's experiences growing up impacted her emergence as a leader in the movement? And yes, this directly ties into what Bridget is saying about Reconstruction. It is a unit that deserves more attention. And this is kind of a bridge to that by really exploring her life and her past. And now Emily's going to provide you with some additional resources and strategies from the collection.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some practical tips and strategies, but I just really appreciate that reframing, particularly around self-defense, and then also just the Fannie Lou Hamer materials are incredible. So I hope everyone does take the time to check those out. Hi, I'm Emily Silas. I'm a teacher in the Boston Public Schools. I teach at the English High School, which is an open enrollment school. Most of my students are English language learners, and nearly all of my students are identified in some way or another as high needs. I have an interesting schedule. I teach 3 sections of US history, specifically to English learners. and I teach one section of general education, or AP US government and politics. And so the resources I'm going to be sharing with you today are resources that come from the US history collection that might be used in a US history class, a government class, or a civics class. Next slide, please. When I'm choosing resources, so today I thought I would just talk a little bit about how I'm interested in broadening my students' understanding of the civil rights movement and all those ways that Alicia and Lindsay discussed, challenging the narrative that everything happened in the South, challenging the narrative that the leaders were old men or religious leaders exclusively, all of those ideas, but also expanding the view of who else used these strategies from the civil rights movement. And then I'm also going to talk about how I adapt these materials for English language learners and how I seek to make modern connections when I do this. So when I'm looking at a resource, if I'm snooping around on PBS Learning Media, I'm thinking about how intensively would I implement a specific video or interactive lesson. And this slide here is just sort of showing you the range of approaches I might take. And so I would, I'm going to highlight just a couple of them with you this evening, and I just have a short amount of time. But for starters, the first thing that I like to do is, if I can, many of the videos are available for download, and I'll show you that on the next slide in a minute. So I do like to do that, or present a printed transcript. Particularly for my English learners, it's super important that they can access the language in written form and also in the audio and the visual. I might use a graphic organizer. I might have my students use the transcripts after they watch the video to do some analysis and some evidence sorting, identifying evidence, doing some writing. I'm also today going to show you a choice board and some cool interactive lessons on PBS Learning Media. Next slide, please. So just regarding selecting the resources, I did just want to make sure that I highlighted. You can see here I circled where it says download. So many of the videos are available for download, and then you could put them into a platform you might already be using, like Edpuzzle or Nearpod, and add questions. You can also add materials to these resources on the PBS Learning Media website if you have your students log in. So that's another option as well. You'll see that there's the transcript option on all of them, so you can always access the transcript. And as Sue was saying in the beginning, I love how adaptable the resources are. I love using the materials that are provided and then adapting them to meet my students' needs. Most of all of the transcripts, the background readings, all of these things, you can take, put them in your own file, put in the vocabulary, highlight that vocabulary that you pre-taught. Whatever it is that you need to do to adapt it for your students is very flexible in that way. And I love doing that with these materials. So then, of course, I'm also looking at my objectives, the tools that are available on the website, the support materials, and just in general, what is the scope of the resource and how in-depth do I want to go on a particular topic. So, oh yes, and slowing down the speed for sure, which you'll note is also an option. So I never speed up, always slow down. Sometimes when I'm previewing something, I might speed it up for myself. But this is another one from the Why It Matters collection that Sue mentioned, another great way to make a modern day connection between some strategies of the past and the present. Next slide, please. So today I just wanted to call your attention to the Youth Stand Up collection. This is a collection that tells the stories of young activists. And this one in particular, I love. It's Moctezuma Esparza, who was one of the student leaders in the student walkouts of East LA in 1968. So again, broadening that scope, including Latino voices, including other young activists in students' learning of the civil rights movement. So I love to use this with a transcript. I added the questions on the side. Students can use the transcript again to collect evidence, to analyze and synthesize information. And I'm doing this because I really want my students to have the opportunity to build that background knowledge so we can do what's next, which is analyze a primary source. Next slide, please. So here, I'd love to take a primary source right after they've watched the video. The video talks about his experience and how it changed his life. So they have this big view. And then I give them the actual text of the student demands from the East LA walkouts, give the students the opportunity to think about what did the students want and why did they want it. And then this allows us to, after, a lesson analyzing this document, this allows us to consider what has happened with Latino education in the intervening years. And this is, of course, of great interest to my students and hopefully to all students as our society grows more diverse, and particularly the needs of English learners need to be better met in our schools. Next slide, please. So this is a lesson that I designed to spin off of that, where my students would analyze data. I got the data from the Pew Charitable Trust, Pew Research. And if you will have all of these resources. So if you want, you can open it up and do whatever you like with it. But the essential question here is, how much has education for Latino students improved since the East LA student walkouts of 1968? So what I'm trying to do is get my students in that activist mindset. Okay, you've learned all of this amazing material, all of these powerful leaders. What are the current issues? How can you envision yourself taking some leadership role in trying to resolve some of the gaps that we still see? And then also, this is my attempt to teach graphing strategies in the history classroom. Next slide, please. So you can see we look at different graphs in small groups. The students are looking at various metrics to assess what is happening now. Next slide, please. And I'm sorry, I kind of jumped ahead a little there, but in that activity, thank you. One question that I love that I added to this after we did it the first time is, what do you think a student who participated in the East LA walkouts would say about this data, to get them to think, have we made progress? Has it been enough progress? To really ask those critical questions. So this is just an example of kind of a series of lessons that I would do just based on that one video. I do also use the Latino Americans resources, fantastic resources that I highly recommend as well. So I have just two more things I'd like to share with you. The last two. Next slide, please, is a choice board. Sometimes I get so excited by the resources that are available on PBS Learning Media, and I can't choose. So I do something called a choice board, and I allow the students to choose what's most interesting to them. So this is, almost all of these resources are from PBS Learning Media. I took the questions, the reflection questions, directly from the teaching resources and put them in here. The students would just choose whichever topics are most interesting to them. And I love this because it provides that differentiation we're looking for. It gives them access to lesser known stories. These are all stories of young people trying to make change. And I saw in the chat that many people are really invested in teaching their students that as well. And the choice often provides challenge, because the students will choose something because they feel passionately about it, but it might be one of the harder resources on the board. Okay, and my last slide, I just wanted to share with the Youth Stand-Up collection. They have all these great interactive lessons that students can go through to actually choose a action research project or a civic action project. So if you really want, if you had the time and you've given them all this great background on all these activists, you could really push them to take the next step on their own. And I know that for many of us, civic education is, especially in Massachusetts, is getting a lot more attention and more of a push, and hopefully some more investment. So I wanted to be sure to share that with all of you, and I'm going to pass it off to Ethan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Okay, well, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and talk about the platform a little bit more than the content that we have on the platform. And I'm gonna do so with an analogy that I will share with you in a moment. Okay. So, yes, as Emily said, my name is Ethan. I'm a project manager here, and I am a member of the product team for PBS Learning Media. So I really work on the platform, the features that it has, and I like to learn about things through analogies. So I'm going to use one to illustrate how PBS Learning Media can help make your day-to-day teaching practices a little easier and provide a kind of nourishment for you as an educator, as well as for your students. And I say nourishment as a nod to this food-based analogy for three ways to share learning media resources with your students. I'll describe each of these briefly in the slides, but I'll also pop over to the live website quickly to demonstrate things so that you can see how they look. But we'll also share links in the chat for help pages for all of this functionality as well. It's also important to note that for most of these features, they're only available if you do have an account on PBS Learning Media. So please sign up. It's always free. There's never any advertising. This is public media after all. So my first example of a way to share resources with your students in the classroom is sort of like a quick snack. In some cases, you may come across a resource that you just want to show, like a video or maybe an image. And those you can do on a projector in your classroom, or you can share links with your students directly with the Share Link with Students button. That essentially sends them the URL for whatever resource that you found on the site. If you use Google Classroom primarily and you have synced your class rosters with PBS Learning Media, you can use Share to Google Classroom, just as you would the Share Link with Students button. In both cases, the student simply receives the URL to the resource page. And when you do so, you can choose to either share the focus view, which is just the media alone, or the full resource view, which includes the support materials that we've talked about that the student can also see alongside the resource. For the sake of time, I'm not going to jump to the website to demonstrate this one. It's pretty straightforward, but just like a snack, it can really help you satisfy that hunger for a piece of educational media in a pinch. But it doesn't quite provide students with everything they would need, like instructions or some supports to go along with that piece of media. So that is where the lesson builder comes in. As you've seen from others tonight, resources on Learning Media provide a lot more than just the media, like a YouTube video would or something. They're made for classroom use with supporting materials for both you and your students. And in particular, the one that I think is most interesting from supporting my analogy is the teaching tips, which I think sorry, I am on the wrong slide. Here we go. Which I think sort of functions as a recipe. And the activities like our background readings, discussion questions, and independent student activities sort of function as ingredients. On most resources, the activities and handouts are in Word documents. So you can download those documents and change them up however you would like, just as we do with tweaking ingredients in recipes when we're in the kitchen. And as Emily demonstrated, there's lots of different ways that you can sort of remix lessons and use them, remix resources and use them in different ways. To take this a step further, we even supply some of the kitchen appliances in the form of the lesson builder. So I'm going to demonstrate this with a teacher account that I have on PBS Learning Media. So right now I'm on the site and I'm signed in with my teacher, who is Nigel Ratburn. If you know the Arthur reference, shout out in the chat. So here's a resource that I found, perusing the site, and I think it's great. I really like the video, but and I've looked at the teaching tips and the other support materials, but I just have a different plan for it. I want to create my own lesson, and I've got a few questions that I like to ask around this topic. So I want to make my own. In this case, it's great to use Build a Lesson. And so I can click that on that resource, and this will take me through a lesson builder where I can give this lesson a title, I can give it some instructions, and it creates basically a sequenced slideshow for students with that piece of media on one of the slides. And I can also then add additional slides, either with another resource that I've found, or questions, or just some text that I would like to add to it. In this case, I'm going to add a question slide. You give that slide a title and some more text like instructions, and then I can choose different types of questions, such as fill in the blank, multiple choice, short answer, true, false, essay question. I'm going to go with a short answer. And at this point, because the students are submitting responses to back to you when you assign them work, we do require that you check the student privacy acknowledgement, which describes all of our policies for keeping your student data safe and private. And so once you've read that and acknowledged that here, you're able to save and assign this assignment to your students. So I can assign this to my class in 3 different ways, as you can see here, either from a class that I've set up directly on LearningMedia, and I've set up my students in a roster here. Or if I use Google Classroom, I can sync my roster with my Google Classroom on PBS Learning Media, or I can use a quick assign code. For the sake of time, I won't go into the details of this. We have some help links, help pages for this as well. But I will say that it's recommended to set up rosters for your classes on either PBS Learning Media or through Google Classroom if you use it, because when you assign work to them and get that work back from your students, it's organized according to those classes, and it's just much easier for you to grade that way. So I will cancel this one for now and go over to an assignment just to show what this looks like when you have work back from students. So why did Ford raise wages was a lesson that I created. I assigned that to my GBH education test class. I have one student in this class named Buster Baxter. I assigned it via Google Classroom. I can see that Buster completed it on January 9th. And from here, I can see the results. And on this particular lesson builder, I set it up with 3 questions. Each of them were short answer questions, and I can see that Buster answered them here. I can read his results. If this was a multiple choice question and I had said it is either correct or incorrect, and Buster got these right or wrong, I would see that here as well. So returning to the analogy, as you can see, there's a bit of prep work on the lesson builder to put that together. Now, say I don't have that much time, but I still want that sort of robust learning experience with readings and questions embedded in it and media on a particular topic. So to stick with the analogy, I don't want to cook tonight. I want to go out to eat. Well, that's where interactive lessons come in, the sort of fine dining of PBS Learning Media. I'll go back to my slides here. And as you saw before that Sue introduced, there's text, there's media, there's questions embedded right next to that media. And these are all written by educators at public media stations around the country. Most of them on the site are written by our team here at GBH. And when the student is logged in, they can save their work as they go. For assigning these interactive lessons, we also recommend using Lesson Builder, but you won't need to use, add the additional questions. It's a much faster process, and I will demonstrate that very briefly now. Back with my Nigel account, I will find an interactive lesson on the site that is my favorite right now, that we recently produced for the US History Collection. And so I've found this interactive lesson. I want to make use of this in my class. I can assign this as a lesson, follow the same steps as before, but you'll see at the bottom of a lesson builder using an interactive lesson that you can only add one slide. That sort of makes it simpler because an interactive lesson already has a bunch of questions along with it. So I can again check this and save and assign to my students. As an example, I've set one up already. Again, Buster Baxter completed this earlier this month, and I can view his results here. For interactive lessons, because they have multiple pages, each with a variety of different activity types, it sends you to a sort of page of the results from that student completing the interactive lesson. I can scroll through them here to check Buster's work, or I can print this and do it as a PDF as well. So that sort of sums up my analogy-ridden tour of some of our teacher features on PBS Learning Media. And I hope you all are all as hungry as I am now. And I think I am passing it to Denise to take us home and let us all go to dinner.
Woo. Thank you, Ethan. That was a lot of information. Gratifying to see in the chat that you all are finding it very useful. We're very proud of this collection. Someone commented that it's clear that a lot of thought went into its organization, and it absolutely did. And you can thank our social studies team of Sue, Lindsay, and Alicia for that. Just want to remind you that we just saw a little slice of it tonight, and there are over 400 resources in the US History Collection. Next slide, please. I think this is going to have, nope. I thought we were going to have a slide with other examples of other collections that we have for US history on the Learning Media site. But I would encourage you to look at American Experience and our frontline collections in full. But, I think it's a good idea to start with the US History Collection. Okay, in last year, as we were publishing the US History Collection, we collaborated with the National Council on the Social Studies on a webinar. Oh, here we go. Sorry, these aren't my slides, so I'm pinch hitting for someone tonight. So here are some of the other collections I was talking about that we think that you would find useful to explore. Next slide, please. So as I started to say, we collaborated with the National Council for the Social Studies on a series of webinars. You can watch the recordings of these webinars on our YouTube site. So just search GBH Education on YouTube and then look for our history and social studies playlist. And these are front and center. You can see some of the themes here as we did tonight. Each webinar focused on a particular theme and brought in resources from the US History Collection. And here are the important links. So a few people have asked about a certificate of attendance. You will want to complete the post-webinar survey in order to receive that certificate. You could see the link here. That will also be in the follow-up email that we send tomorrow. It will come tomorrow at about this time. And you will also have the links for the resource folder and the different interactive resources, the different resources by type that Sue talked about at the top of the webinar. And thank you all again. If you have any questions, email Carolyn Jacobs here. You can also email education@wgbh.org. If you would like to leave your thoughts about your takeaways about this webinar, please do so in the chat. We're going to leave the chat open for a couple of minutes so that you can add any comments or questions.